Our next speaker is Marge Good, and many of you may be familiar with Marge. She has worked in research, in cancer research, since 1988 or so, and in 1993 she became the manager of the Wichita CCOP. Within the last 5 years or so, she's been at NCI, and she is a nurse consultant with the NCI Division of Cancer Prevention, and her primary role is to provide support to the CCOP network. So if you're a CCOP administrator, you realize how important her role has been to us. We appreciate that. Marge is going to speak about about assessing clinical trial associated workload. This is something that she's been working on for a couple of years, if not more. I think she worked on it before at Wichita even, didn't you? So I'll let Marge Good move up to the podium, and if there's time after Marge speaks, we will be taking some CCDR questions if y'all are still available for questions.
Thank you, Lisa, and hello to everyone. I've worked with my love, or my not love, I guess it's been more of a frustration for many years in trying to assess clinical trial associated workload. Actually been working with it probably, well, I did it for 10 or 11 years while at Wichita, 3 years, so close to 15 years. So a little bit of history in working with that. So I'm happy to talk to you today about it, and you'll see the slides. I now do work at the NCI, and you'll see these slides have ASCO logos, which is because ASCO has been very supportive in moving forward much of the work that we did in Wichita, and have developed and are currently finishing a project looking at assessing clinical trial workload. So I'm doing it in light of that activity. So some objectives for today: I want to explain the importance of assessing clinical trial associated workload. It is quite important, and actually from my experience in working with this ASCO project, very important to many people. And I want to describe a workload assessment tool that's been developed. So I'm going to give you a little background, as well as to talk about what we've been doing within ASCO, looking at current tools, researching, assessing the literature, and then talk to you about the project, and then what some of the future directions we hope to move forward to. And I don't have to tell many of you in the room, if you've worked in clinical trials for even a short period of time, that you realize that there are many challenges associated with managing clinical trials. And today, if you've been in it for many years at all, you realize that today's trials are very heterogeneous, they're increasing in complexity, and while doing all of that, the funding seems to be going down. It's definitely not keeping up. So we know we need to work efficiently and effectively. And if we don't, and as a result, as many of you may be aware as well, that there's a high turnover and burnout rate amongst clinical trial staff. And as a result of that, data management and quality are often negatively affected. So we need to really work on how we can make the job more satisfying and less burdensome. So why develop a workload assessment tool? Well, as I stated, workload is an important issue. There was a survey, which I will give a little more detail in the next slides, that ASCO conducted amongst its community-based sites, and actually developing a tool to assess workload was ranked in the top 4. It's important that we try to develop some sort of benchmarking information related to clinical trials associated workload. How do we compare one research program to another? How do we compare as a program to another? How many patients should one nurse or CRA manage, and manage them well? And if we had that information, we could provide validation for the need for more staff, but it also could help us if staff are coming to you as a manager or a coordinator and they're saying they're overburdened and overworked. How do you know they're overburdened and overworked compared to what? And maybe it's not so much they're overburdened, but maybe processes are not effective or efficient, and maybe you need to relook at that instead. But if you don't know how you compare, you don't even know to do that. It also could be very important in justifying budgets, particularly for grant applications or even some of your own in-house projects. It also becomes very important, as being a previous manager of a program, important for staff management. It helps you to assess and redistribute the workload amongst your staff. It can be a tool that you can use to evaluate staff-specific accruing issues. If one person is screening a lot of patients, but very few are going on, what are maybe some of the issues that are behind that? You can also use it as a method to maybe more accurately look at data delinquency levels, and actually all of that information then is very important. I found very useful in my annual performance reviews. So to kind of look at this in the more of the full circle and how I think a clinical trial assessment can really have many implications. By assessing workload regularly, you're able to ensure workload is more balanced among your research staff. A balanced workload and achieving a national benchmark, if we had one, which hopefully would relate to adequate staffing, can lead to improved staff satisfaction, which leads to decrease in burnout and turnover, and therefore you're retaining your experienced staff. And by retaining experienced staff, you're improving likelihood of improved data quality and timeliness, which can lead to an increased request for participation in more trials from various sponsors. And therefore, if you have more trials, and you can have the higher likelihood of increased accrual and more trials to offer to more of your patient population, you therefore are probably going to bring in more funds. You can then therefore increase your staff, and the cycle kind of continues. So workload is very important. So to give you a little bit of background as far as the ASCO project. ASCO in the spring of 2011 assessed their community-based practices with a survey, and with the goal of assessing their needs related to the conduct of clinical trials. And one of the questions they asked was, how helpful would various research-related projects be if they were developed by ASCO? And within the results then, workload assessment was ranked 4 out of 12. The 4th out of 12. And the top 2 were insurance related, how to take care of, how to affect insurance issues related to clinical trials. So, which is a very important issue, but to have a workload ranked number 4 was quite impressive. So the Community Research Forum convened a workload assessment working group, which I had the pleasure of chairing, along with several community-based physicians and research nurses and administrators. Our goals of the working group were to develop a tool that we thought would be simple, reproducible, and usable in the long term. If it wasn't going to meet those goals, chances are it wasn't going to be used. We wanted to implement it within the community research programs, and this was a back and forth. Should we community? Should we include academic? Should we? And for the purposes of research and actually getting the project done, we narrowed it down, and we wanted to keep it within the community-based programs. We wanted it to establish a clinical trial workload metric or benchmarks. And we also then wanted to help research sites staff workload based on the complexity of the research protocols themselves, as well as to look at the number of patients assigned to each of the research nurses or CRAs. So some of our preliminary efforts were to review the literature. We found 6 tools, some published, some not. We compared the tools. We looked at the common elements that they incorporated. We looked at the diversity of the tools. We looked at their complexity levels, as well as then how they were feasible they were going to be able to be used within community practice settings. And this is a table which is kind of small font, but hopefully you can read it within your handouts, of the 6 tools that we looked at. And you can, I won't go through each of these in detail, but oh, here's the mouse. Okay. Some of them were quite complex. Looking at, they assign points to various protocol tasks, and then how many hours per task times the points, and then you got a score, and it's like, I found that really too much for me. I couldn't think about going to that. One particular one, some of these were actually quite good, but, how do you get this thing? Okay. But they were so complex, they weren't going to be used. And actually, the US Oncology had a really nice tool that assigned scores or points to 21 grading criteria, and the complexity of them was based on the number of points. The higher the points, the higher the score. But they actually reported that their sites weren't able to use this tool themselves. US Oncology had to go to these sites and conduct this evaluation themselves. So I thought, okay, well, that tells us something that's probably not going to be a very good tool. However, the criteria they used were very good. There was also one called Opal out of Canada, and the University of Michigan also had an effort that they conducted looking at staff time, and this was self-reported staff time, how much time they spent on various activities. Again, if you've worked in the field very long, I thought that would be really challenging to get staff to stop long enough to document hash marks, whatever, how long it took them to do some tasks. So, and then we did an assessment in Wichita while I was the administrator. And this was just recently published in JOP, which are the reference information there. But we tried to keep it simple, and I'll go through more detail of the Wichita tool in here in a bit. But it's basically rankings trials on a 1 to 4 scoring basis and looking only at 6 increments. And as you can look on some of this was probably about the only tool that we actually found any numbers that reported any kind of information related to numbers of patients per nurse over a time period. And this was actually data collected over 10 to 11 years, so it had long term. So again, we looked at the literature. We found it was increasing. Again, kind of reiterated the fact that this was becoming more and more of an important issue. There were tools being developed, but there still was no validated metric or maximum metric to help sites to know the number of research sites, number of research participants to staff ratio. And because the Wichita tool seemed to be simpler, seemed to have some long-term ability to be used, because we used it for over 10 years. The working group, even though I was chair, I tried to stay unbiased, we selected the Wichita workload metric to move forward with the project. But we did tweak it, we did change, we did modify it. The Wichita tool was our own Excel spreadsheet, basically, whereas the ASCO became a web-based tool and much more refined when looking at the actual criteria for evaluating a trial, and as well as for evaluating the number of patients per staff. So I want to give you a little bit of closer view of what we did in Wichita so you can have that as some background. We began looking at this back in 1999 officially. Back then, we kind of tracked numbers of patients per nurse, but not on a real regular basis. But we did begin to see that some nurses who were taking care of acute leukemia patients were a lot busier than the nurses that had a majority of adjuvant breast cancer patients. Staff started getting a little disgruntled amongst themselves and kind of, not want to say bickering, but there was a little frustration between, it's like, how I'm just buried, I can't keep up, and I have to do daily logs on these CRFs, and the persons that's seeing the neoadjuvant or the adjuvant breast patients are not having that much of work to do. They're not as busy. So we realize there's some unequal distribution. And back then, and still even somewhat now, although this is not really formally documented anywhere, and even in the NCI I have not found that, but back then it was kind of, 1 FTE was equal to 40 credits or 40 enrollments, and that's how most sites were funded for staffing. But that didn't really reflect the individual trial differences related to how difficult trials were. Many trials, and they still are, 1 credit per treatment trial, or even 1 credit per cancer control enrollment. Some trials now are 2 credits, particularly the children's oncology group trials with the acute leukemics, which justifiably need to be at least 2 credits. But it's not as across the board differences in credits assigned. It's basically an average of 1. So back then, there was definitely no literature related to clinical trial associated workload measuring, but there were beginning to start to see some literature related to measuring workload on oncology or nursing units. And Giovannetti, back in 1979, began to work with grouping patients into categories on nursing units. And she first started using the term acuity system, which was a scoring system in which each patient care requirement was associated with a score. Then in the 1980s, the patient classification systems were implemented, and nursing units were commonly using patient classification system based on patient acuity, or the difficulty level of taking care of patients, based on how critically ill they were. So we decided to somewhat model after the acuity system. That was our basis for developing the workload assessment that we were doing. So we looked at patients that were on study, on active treatment. We developed classifications because we felt there was differences between these. And we did this for treatment as well as cancer control trials. We also looked at patients in off-treatment follow-up. Now, these were patients that were still on study, but off-treatment, still needing to be followed according to the protocol, but not on active treatment. And there were another category we considered off-study. They were no longer following the protocol. We were basically submitting vital status information only. We looked at various elements of what we felt were important to measure acuity. We looked at complexity of treatment, protocol-specific lab testing requirements, toxicity potential, data forms required, the complexity as well as the number of forms, the degree of coordination required to make that study happen with the various departments and other offices, as well as the number of randomization and steps. And do keep in mind, this was something we did almost 15 years ago now. So what we did with trials then is a little different than what we do now. And then we would rank this study according to the scoring rankings. One was observational registry trial or follow-up only. Two were trials that were primarily oral agents or laboratory-only study. There were fairly minimal toxicities associated with these studies, and often many of our cancer control symptom management studies fell into the two category. Three was a study that involved chemotherapy and or radiation treatment. There were higher numbers of elements included, including the toxicity potential was higher, and the workload associated with the elements that we were considering were higher than a 2. Four was a study that we considered very complex. Multiple drug regimen, high degree of toxicity potential, a majority of workload elements applied to this category. And many of these studies were bone marrow transplant, leukemia, lymphoblastic lymphoma, myeloma. And a 3 then was a majority of the phase 3 randomized trials. So it's fairly simple. We didn't go into 10 different categories or 8. Opal, on the study, or the Workload 2 that was out of Canada, had 8 levels that they looked at. And from my experience, that was probably too many and really made it more complex. So in calculating the acuity, on a monthly basis, we were able to generate lists of patients per nurse by protocol. We had categories, again, of on-active treatment, and were subcategories into treatment versus cancer control. And then we had off-treatment follow-up lists, and those, again, were on-study and the off-study. We looked also at the number of days worked per week. We didn't expect a nurse that worked 3 days a week to have the same load as someone who worked 5 days a week, so we looked at the number of days worked per week. And then we provided each nurse on a monthly basis their individual acuity level and what the team average was, so they knew where they kind of fell in relation to the team. And this is kind of just an example of, and you can tell by the study numbers that this is pretty old, but the acuity levels for studies, these were 3s and a 4, this was a leukemia trial, and times the number of patients, and then came up with a score, and then the scores were totaled, and this was a total score, and this person worked 5 days a week, divided that by 5, so the total on active treatment acuity was 8.2. Now this is very abbreviated and short. Nurses had many more patients and many more trials than this. This is just an example so you could see how it worked. We also looked at, on a monthly basis, then looked at patient levels, the actual patients per category, and the actual number of patients screened per month. And then we looked at quality assurance associated levels of numbers of queries, the number of overdue initial form submissions, as well as overdue follow-up data submissions. And this is kind of a lot of information in one slide, in a sense, or graph. The top dotted line are the numbers of patients on active treatment per nurse FTE. And so you can see this is spikes up quite and down, and some of the I have to explain a little bit as to this spiked up as we became more involved with pharmaceutical trials, And it spiked back down when we moved pharmaceutical trials out of the CCOP. So the numbers of patients by nurse went down at that point. This also is skewed, I have to honestly, this is some of the limitations with this, is you still, within our system, much of how we track patients by nurse were dependent on the nurse updating her list of patients and how many of them were actually still on treatment versus off treatment. And we had one nurse or two that in this time period did not shift patients over to the off-treatment category. So it's still was going up. We felt sure it was still going up. However, it was probably falsely elevated somewhat in this level here. But then if you look at the actual acuity scores, you don't see as severe of ups and downs as you do with the actual, if you just looked at numbers of patients on trial. And then the red dotted dash are the actual new enrollments per nurse per month, per year. And the average acuity then increased from 19 or 20 or so in the early beginnings up to as high as 45 and with an average of about 30. And so to us, that acuity score means something, but to those of you who don't do acuity scores, that number doesn't mean necessarily much of anything. However, if we can get this and that metric as a benchmark and everybody has it to compare to and everybody measures their patients the same way, it would mean something. So that's definitely a goal. But if you look at cancer control trial acuity, you see much more variability within the workload. This was the enrollments to the STAR trial as well as other cancer symptom management trials, and you can see the associated enrollments going with that. This is probably still in effect somewhat of even BCPT and PCPT, and then those highly accruing symptom or prevention trials kind of wavered off, and then again we had SELECT, and the later years here we also had smoking cessation studies. The variability was truly related to the trials that we had access to at the time. But again, if we only looked at numbers of patients per nurse, I would have been hiring in here probably, just looking at that, because I felt like, whoa, we're really busy. But if you looked at the actual acuity scores and cancer control, again, not as complex usually. Patients aren't on study as long. The regimens or treatments are not as severe in toxicity. There is more challenge with them and screening and recruitment, I feel. But once you get a patient on study, the actual workload, in my mind, and we went back and forth with this, was not as difficult as the patients that are on treatment trials. And Keisha's probably still dealing with that. So anyway, it just gives you an idea of how I think acuity and actually looking at workload related to the level of difficulty within a study probably gives you a little bit more information than just looking at patients. So how did we use the acuity information? We did feel like we were balancing our workload between staff, looking at monthly individual scores as well as the team average. We were able to say with one nurse whose acuity was really spiking up and looking really busy and someone else's was not so high, we would encourage her not to take on new patients that month, and let's let this nurse take on a few more patients so she can build her workload up and try to keep it balanced. So it was very good for that. It also did provide some validation to management and administration that we needed to increase our staff numbers. Not having that before, it was very difficult to get them to hear me and say, we're dying, we need more help. So we now had metrics to produce. It was also, again, a really important management assessment tool. I could look more specifically at the individual nurses and seeing what issues they might be having in accruing patients, talking to patients about studies, how comfortable they were with it, what specific issues they might have been having. It allowed me to look at data submission delinquency levels, and again, I used it for annual performance reviews. So now let's go back to the ASCO effort. Again, we used the Wichita CCOP scoring criteria. We did modify it and clarify some things that I had learned from experience that I felt needed to be changed, as well as getting the input and feedback back from the working group. We did tweak and clarify things. We developed a protocol acuity score assignment worksheet. which I'll show you here in a bit. We tested this then again among the working group members. I chose them and then had the working group review the trials and assign an acuity score. I chose 6 cooperative group trials from varying groups, treatment and cancer control. We had 100% congruence. It was so reassuring to know that that could happen. Now, again, this was a group of people who had been working with Workload for a while, so we felt we needed to take it outside of the group, and so we presented it at an ASCO Community Research Forum, as well as at a CCOP and minority-based CCOP PI and administrators meetings. And here, because of time, we reduced it to 3 SWOG trials. We had 80 to 100% agreement for the treatment trials for assigning a score, and we had a little bit less agreement with the cancer control, and they are a little more challenging to figure out how complex they are sometimes with varying types of interventions, behavioral versus drug versus others. So we felt it was still really good, pretty good congruence. People were using the tool appropriately and coming up with the same numbers. So our next step then was to design and conduct an ASCO clinical trial workload assessment tool project. ASCO IT department developed a web-based electronic data capture tool. I can't thank ASCO enough for all this work that they've done to help make this move forward. I could never have done this on my own to develop this, so it was very key for them to be able to be interested in this as well. Our goal was then to test this tool in multiple community-based research sites. Our objectives were to determine the feasibility of using a common clinical trial-associated workload tool among community-based sites. We wanted to gather information regarding average acuity levels per research staff. We wanted to look at cooperative group as well as industry trials, and we wanted to look at the various categories. We wanted to look at patients on study on active treatment. We wanted to look at off treatment on study, and we wanted to look at off study. And we wanted to do that by research staff. And we also then wanted to use those same categories, but look at the number of patients, again, comparing acuity to patients, and look at it by FTE versus number of days per week worked. We wanted to then use the information and feedback from the sites to refine the tool further for hopefully eventually being able to offer it to the broader ASCO membership. And as a method of trying to determine what our next steps were going to be, we wanted to, for sites that had the ability to tell us, we wanted to ask them if they could tell us how some of their screening related information. How many patients do they screen a month versus went on study? So we could start looking at the workload associated with screening. So we, again, narrowed it down to community-based oncology research programs. And I have to say, we had multiple academic sites that wanted to participate, but we had to say, no, we're keeping it to community-based. We were hoping to have a goal of obtaining 25 to 30 participating sites. We felt with that number, we could come up with some pretty good statistical data and have some good outcomes. So we began recruiting from participation of attendees at the Community Research Forum. We talked at the NCI CCOPs and minority-based CCOPs, and we included the NCCCPs. We offered it to the ONS Clinical Trials Nurses SIG, Special Interest Group, as well as Sarah Cannon Research Institute and U.S. Oncology Network. To be eligible to participate, they had to be a community-based research program. They had to currently be accruing to industry and/or NCI-funded cooperative group trials. They had to have the ability to produce lists that we needed the information from, a number of patients enrolled by the specific categories. They needed to be willing to collect and enter the data into the web-based tool in a timely manner, and they needed to be willing to participate in scheduled training, planning, and evaluation conference calls. The site's responsibility then was to participate in the training, as well as to assign acuity scores to each of their active trials. They had a spreadsheet to fill in the trials number, the sponsor, and then they needed to assign a score using the worksheet, which I'll show you again here in a bit. They had to assign a score to the trials. They then submitted that to ASCO. ASCO went in and entered all the information that they gave them on each of their trials into the tool. And we did this for the project just for quality assurance sake, so we had the information entered as commonly as possible. We still ran into issues. I can't tell you how many people label trials differently out there. Even with the cooperative groups, I was amazed, but particularly with industry. The same industry trial can be named 5 or 6 different things across different groups. And then we were like puzzled, like, is this the same thing as this one? And you know, what saved us many times was going to the clinicaltrials.gov CTN, getting the NCTN number off of that. But we learned a lot from this, and we're going to publish as much of this as we can. But basically, ASCO entered it, but then on a monthly basis, each site was required to go in and enter the number of patients per nurse or CRA per study. And this began on June 2013. And they entered actually beginning data from May 2013. They did it for 6 months. And they needed on a monthly basis to verify with us if there were any changes to staffing, as well as did they activate or open any new trials. They were also asked to complete follow-up surveys. They did these online. They were very short, simple. We basically did these on a monthly basis and at the completion of the project. And the questions were going to provide us some feedback about the utility of the tool, and as well as satisfaction levels, what issues did they run into. We looked at 2 acuity metrics, and these were things that were a little bit confusing for participants, so we felt it was important to clarify. We looked at protocol acuity score. This was the score assigned to on-study studies that had patients on study active treatment. Those were assigned a score, again, of 1 to 4. The ones that were in follow-up, any patients in follow-up were assigned an acuity score of 1. And that included patients on study, off active treatment, as well as off study. Then we did a nurse acuity, or nurse CRA acuity score for each individual nurse or nurse team. The calculation we used was the actual score assigned to the protocol times the number of patients, and then divided that by the FTE. Very simple. This is an example, or what the workload scoring assignment worksheet looked like. This first step was to evaluate the protocol for workload-related elements. Again, we just look at it broadly, wanted them to look at the complexity of the treatment, the trial-specific laboratory or testing requirements, the treatment toxicity potential, the data forms required, again, looking at complexity in a number of forms, the degree of coordination required, how much involvement of ancillary departments or outside offices and sites were going to be required, and the number of randomizations or steps. And after looking at these criteria elements, they were then to assign a score of 1 to 4. 1, again, being observational registry or patients in follow-up. 2 being oral agents with minimal toxicity, test procedures considered standard of care, data forms required basic information only, easily captured from the medical record, required minimal coordination, and a non-randomized or a single randomization. And again, these were very commonly the laboratory correlative science studies, cancer control symptom management, and hormone therapy trials. 3 was a study that was testing chemotherapy and or radiation, and it could include also the higher toxicity potential oral agents trials. There was increased toxicity potential when compared to a 2. It involved non-standard of care research tests and procedures. Data forms were more complex or higher in number, required more coordination, 1 to 2 other disciplines. And there was a single time point randomized phase 2 or 3. And these, again, were the majority of the phase 2 and 3 trials. And then there were the 4s, those very complex, multiple trial drug regimens, high degree of toxicity potential, involves multiple non-standard of care research tests. The data forms are far more complex, daily to weekly data collection required, and there's higher in number. They required multiple coordinations, more than 2 departments or divisions, and multiple randomizations or steps. And again, these were primarily the bone marrow transplant, acute leukemia, lymphoblastic lymphoma, myeloma. So, as I said before, the ASCO entered the tool, all the information into the tool regarding this, the studies and the scores assigned from each of the sites. And a point to make is We also went back and forth is, do we want to centrally assign this acuity score, or do we want each of the sites to assign their own score? And we decided that it was important that they each assign their own score, because each community might have variabilities into how difficult one trial might be for one site versus for another. So we allowed each site to enter their own scores and difficulty ranges. And we're going to look at that when we look at the overall data then to see how different scores were for different studies, compare each study across sites. So basically, when they went in to enter the data, the nurse label was there, the site-specific information was there, and the study ID was there. And we labeled them according to on-study, treatment, off-study, on study, off treatment, and then off study. So there were 3 categories possibly for each trial. And then all they had to do was enter in the number of patients. And they did that on a monthly basis. Well, I'll give you a little bit of an update. I don't have final results. We're still in the statistical analysis phase, but just to confirm the interest and the level of interest in workload. We had over 100 sites want to participate in this project. We were overwhelmed. We were like, wow. It was exciting to see. We ended up with 52 actually completing data collection over the 6 months, far more than our 25 to 30. That was our original goal. And they were so good to work with us. There's probably several of you in the room. I don't know if there are. You can wave your hands in the air, and I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. Lisa, you're not, oh, you did some, yeah. And Keisha, you guys aren't raising your hand. Okay, anyway, we have over 13,000 rows of data to look at. We are thrilled. So it's taking us a little longer to do now the data assessment or the statistical analysis than we thought. So that's why we don't have results. We do hope to have them by findings available in the summer or fall of this year, and we will be publishing it and presenting that. We did limit this workload assessment to patient-centered research personnel, and again, that was a challenge when we started. We wanted to look across the board, but if we wanted to get the project done, we felt we needed to narrow it down to a specific scope. So our future goals are to look at the broader area of clinical trials workload. And we do hope, and our goal is the tool is being further refined now based on the participants' feedback, but we do hope to have the tool available to the public through ASCO by the end of this summer or in early fall. So look forward to that. This is just a map showing the location of the participating sites. It was really a nice range across the country. We have CCOPs, we have minority-based CCOPs, we have NCCCP sites, we have private practice sites, community hospital sites. I mean, it's going to be a broad range, and we're going to look at each of those somewhat individually as well to see if there's differences between. And to conclude, again, I keep saying this over and over, we know that now that clinical trial-associated workload is a significant issue. We hope this current project will give us some of those benchmark metrics that we've all been wanting for many years, and it will be coming soon. We will be offering the workload assessment tool to the oncology membership as well as the broader oncology research field. And we do know we need to do more evaluations, more work. We do want to look at this, testing this within the academic settings. There's strong interest there, and I think we do need that. We need that information. We know also we need to look at other areas of clinical trial associated workload, regulatory screening, clinical trial billing, credentialing. There's just so many pieces of managing clinical trial workload that we know we still need to look at, and we hope to do in the next future. I'd like to acknowledge key people at ASCO that this couldn't have happened without them, as well as to thank all the participating sites. They were phenomenal to work with. And with that, I'll open questions for this, but we'll also open questions for, God, we have, what, 30 minutes? I really did go through this. For anyone who has questions regarding the CCDR presentations that were held prior.